Sarah Martinez stepped out of her rental car and looked up at the towering gates of Naval Base Norfolk. The massive steel structures seemed to reach toward the cloudy Virginia sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. She took a deep breath, adjusting the collar of her crisp white uniform. After 15 years away from military life, she was finally returning to where it all began. The morning air carried the familiar scent of salt water mixed with diesel fuel from the nearby ships. Sarah could hear the distant sound of engines rumbling and the sharp calls of seagulls overhead. These sounds brought back memories she had tried to forget for so long. As she walked toward the main entrance, Sarah pulled down the sleeves of her jacket slightly. The action was automatic, a habit she had developed over the years. Beneath the fabric, intricate tattoo designs covered most of her arms. The artwork told the story of her military service, her struggles, and her journey to healing. Each symbol, each line, each splash of color had deep meaning to her. The security checkpoint was busier than she remembered. Young sailors in their dress uniforms moved through the lines with practiced efficiency. Sarah noticed how young they all looked. When she was their age, she thought she knew everything about life and service. Now at 42, she understood how little any of them really knew about what lay ahead. "Ma'am, I need to see your identification and orders," said the security guard, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25. His uniform was spotless and his posture was perfect. Sarah handed over her papers, watching as he examined them carefully. "You're here for the ceremony?" he asked, looking up from the documents. "Yes, the Medal of Honor ceremony," Sarah replied quietly. She still couldn't quite believe she was saying those words. After all these years, the military was finally recognizing what happened during her deployment in Afghanistan. The events that changed her life forever were about to be acknowledged in the highest way possible. The guard handed back her papers with a respectful nod. "Thank you for your service, ma'am. The ceremony area is in Building 7. Follow the main road and turn left at the second intersection." Sarah thanked him and continued walking. The base was much larger than she remembered, with new buildings and facilities that hadn't existed during her time here. She had been stationed at Norfolk for 2 years early in her career, fresh out of basic training and eager to prove herself. Those days seemed like a lifetime ago. As she made her way through the base, Sarah noticed groups of personnel gathering near various buildings. Word had clearly spread about the ceremony. It wasn't every day that someone received the Medal of Honor, especially someone who had left the military under difficult circumstances. The path to Building 7 took her past the barracks where she had once lived. The old brick structures looked exactly the same, with their neat rows of windows and perfectly maintained landscaping. She remembered the countless mornings she had rushed out of those doors, trying not to be late for formation. She remembered the friendships formed in those hallways, and the heartbreak of losing some of those friends overseas. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her sister. "Saw the news article about today. So proud of you. Mom would be proud too." Sarah smiled slightly and put the phone away. Her mother had passed away 3 years earlier, never knowing that her daughter's military service would eventually be recognized in this way. The crowd around Building 7 was larger than Sarah had expected. She could see news crews setting up their equipment, and several high-ranking officers were already in position near the entrance. The sight made her stomach flutter with nervousness. She had never enjoyed being the center of attention, even during her active duty days. "Excuse me, are you Sarah Martinez?" A young woman in a Navy uniform approached her. "I'm Lieutenant Johnson. I'll be escorting you to the preparation area." Sarah nodded and followed the lieutenant through a side entrance. The building's interior was all polished floors and official portraits of distinguished naval officers. The air conditioning hummed quietly, providing relief from the humid Virginia morning. "The ceremony will begin in about 2 hours," Lieutenant Johnson explained as they walked. "General Harrison wanted to meet with you beforehand. He's very excited about today's recognition." General Harrison. Sarah had heard the name but had never met him personally. She wondered what he would think of her, especially given how her military career had ended. The circumstances of her departure from the Navy had been complicated and painful. Many people hadn't understood her decisions back then. They reached a small conference room where Sarah was told to wait. The room contained a simple table, several chairs, and a large window overlooking the harbor. She could see destroyers and aircraft carriers docked in the distance, their gray hulls gleaming in the morning sun. The sight of those massive ships brought back powerful memories of her deployment days. Sarah sat down and tried to calm her racing thoughts. In just a few hours, she would be standing in front of hundreds of people, receiving recognition for actions she had tried to forget. The events in Afghanistan had haunted her for years. The explosion that killed 3 of her teammates. The hours she spent pulling wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. The decision to disobey direct orders to save lives. That decision had ultimately led to her leaving the military. Her commanding officers at the time hadn't appreciated her choice to prioritize human lives over mission objectives. The official records had been classified, and for 15 years, Sarah had carried the weight of those events alone. She looked down at her hands, thinking about the tattoos hidden beneath her sleeves. Each design represented a fallen friend, a lesson learned, or a moment of growth. The artwork had been her way of processing trauma and honoring those who didn't make it home. But she knew that many people in the military still viewed tattoos negatively, especially extensive ones like hers. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Ma'am, it's time," Lieutenant Johnson called out. Sarah stood up, straightened her uniform one final time, and walked toward the door. Whatever happened next, she was ready to face it. After 15 years of silence, her story was finally going to be told. The truth about what happened in Afghanistan, and why she had made the choices she did, would finally come to light. As she stepped into the hallway, Sarah could hear the sound of people gathering outside. The ceremony was about to begin, and there was no turning back now. The ceremony area was filling up quickly as Sarah made her way to the designated seating section. Rows of metal chairs had been arranged in perfect formation, facing a small stage where the presentation would take place. Military personnel, family members, and invited guests were taking their seats while photographers positioned themselves for the best angles. Sarah felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her as she walked down the center aisle. Some faces showed curiosity, others respect, and a few displayed expressions she couldn't quite read. She kept her chin up and her shoulders straight, drawing on years of military training to maintain her composure. "There's the hero," she heard someone whisper as she passed. The word made her uncomfortable. She had never considered herself a hero, just someone who did what needed to be done when others were in danger. Lieutenant Johnson guided her to a seat in the front row, just a few feet from where the ceremony would take place. Sarah could see the podium clearly, along with the American flag and Navy flag that flanked it. A small table nearby held the Medal of Honor in its presentation case, the blue ribbon and gold star catching the morning light. Behind her, Sarah could hear conversations buzzing with excitement and speculation. Many of the younger service members had probably never attended a Medal of Honor ceremony before. It was one of the rarest honors in the military, awarded only for acts of valor that went far beyond the call of duty. "I can't believe she's actually here," someone said behind her. "I thought the whole thing was just a rumor. My instructor at the Naval Academy told us about what happened in Afghanistan," another voice replied. "Said it was classified for years because of the political implications." Sarah tried not to listen, but the conversations were impossible to ignore. She wondered how much these people actually knew about what had happened, and how much was just speculation and gossip that had grown over the years. A commotion near the entrance caught everyone's attention. Several high-ranking officers were entering the ceremony area, their uniforms adorned with ribbons and stars that indicated years of distinguished service. Sarah recognized some of the faces from military publications and news coverage. Then she saw him. General Harrison was a tall man with silver hair and a commanding presence that immediately drew attention. Even from a distance, Sarah could tell he was someone who demanded respect through his bearing alone. He spoke briefly with other officers before making his way toward the front of the ceremony area. As he approached, Sarah noticed something she hadn't expected. The general was rolling up his sleeves slightly, revealing what appeared to be the edge of a tattoo on his forearm. It was subtle, barely visible, but definitely there. Sarah felt a small surge of relief. Maybe her own tattoos wouldn't be as much of an issue as she had feared. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats," announced a voice over the sound system. "The ceremony will begin in 5 minutes." The crowd quickly settled into their chairs. Sarah could feel her heart beating faster as the moment approached. She had rehearsed what she would say if asked to speak, but she still felt nervous about being in front of so many people. A group of young sailors sitting several rows behind Sarah were having a quiet conversation that she couldn't help but overhear. Heard she has tattoos all over her arms, one of them said. Like completely covered. That's so unprofessional, another replied. I don't understand why they would honor someone who, obviously, doesn't respect military standards. Maybe the standards were different back then, a third voice suggested. Standards are standards, the second sailor insisted. Tattoos like that show poor judgment and lack of discipline. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. She had expected some negative reactions, but hearing the criticism so directly was still painful. These young sailors had no idea what she had been through or why her tattoos were important to her. She wanted to turn around and explain that each tattoo represented a fallen comrade or a moment of survival. She wanted to tell them about the months of counseling and therapy that had helped her process her trauma. She wanted them to understand that her tattoos were not about rebellion or poor judgment, but about healing and remembrance. Instead, she sat quietly and tried to focus on the positive aspects of the day. After 15 years of silence, her actions in Afghanistan were finally being recognized. The families of the soldiers she had saved would be there to see her honored. The truth about what happened would finally be told. She probably got those tattoos after she left the service. One of the sailors continued. No way she had them while she was active duty. Either way, it's embarrassing for the Navy, came the reply. They should have picked someone else to represent our values. Sarah's hands clenched into fists in her lap. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that these young people didn't know her story. They were making judgments based on limited information and their own preconceptions about what a service member should look like. The sound system crackled to life again. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the presentation of colors. Everyone in the ceremony area stood as a color guard marched forward, carrying the American flag and the Navy flag. The sight of the flag stirring in the morning breeze brought back powerful memories for Sarah. She remembered standing at attention during countless ceremonies just like this one during her active duty. Years as the national anthem played, Sarah sang along quietly, her voice mixing with hundreds of others. Despite the hurtful comments she had overheard, she still felt a deep connection to the military and everything it represented. Her service had shaped who she was even during the difficult times. When the anthem ended and everyone returned to their seats, Sarah noticed that the general was looking in her direction. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a slight nod of acknowledgement. There was something in his expression that suggested understanding, maybe even approval. The ceremony was about to begin, and Sarah knew there was no backing out now. Whatever reactions her appearance might generate, whatever criticism she might face, she was here to honor the memory of those who didn't make it home. That was more important than any negative comments or disapproving looks. A chaplain approached the podium to deliver the opening prayer. As his voice carried across the ceremony area, Sarah closed her eyes and thought about her fallen teammates. She thought about the split-second decisions that had saved lives and cost others. She thought about the weight of survival and the responsibility that came with being honored for actions taken in the worst of circumstances. Today would mark a new chapter in her life, one where her story could finally be told in full. The opening prayer concluded, and the chaplain stepped away from the podium. A Navy captain approached the microphone to serve as the ceremony's master of ceremonies. His voice was clear and authoritative as he addressed the gathered crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to recognize extraordinary courage and sacrifice in the face of overwhelming odds. The Medal of Honor represents the highest level of bravery and selflessness that our nation can acknowledge. Sarah listened to the formal words while trying to calm her nerves. She could feel the attention of the crowd focused on the stage, knowing that soon all eyes would be on her. The captain continued with a brief history of the Medal of Honor and its significance in American military tradition. Behind her, she could still hear occasional whispered comments from the group of young sailors. Their words continued to sting, but Sarah tried to focus on the positive energy she felt from other parts of the crowd. Many people seemed genuinely excited to witness such a rare and important ceremony. The events we commemorate today took place 15 years ago in the mountains of Afghanistan, the captain announced. During a mission that went tragically wrong, one service member's actions under fire saved the lives of 7 wounded soldiers. Sarah's mind immediately transported her back to that terrible day. She could almost smell the dust and smoke, hear the sound of gunfire echoing off the rocky terrain. The memory was as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. Her unit had been conducting a reconnaissance mission in a remote valley when they were ambushed by enemy forces. The attack came from multiple directions, catching her team completely off guard. Within minutes, half of her squad was wounded, and their communications equipment was destroyed. The explosion that followed had been devastating. Sarah could still remember the deafening sound and the way the ground shook beneath her feet. When the smoke cleared, 3 of her teammates were dead, and several others were critically injured. During the chaos that followed, the captain continued, Petty Officer Martinez made the decision to disobey direct orders from her commanding officer. Instead of retreating to a safe position as ordered, she remained in the danger zone to evacuate wounded personnel. Sarah remembered that moment clearly. Her commanding officer had been screaming over the radio for all able-bodied personnel to fall back to a defensive position. The enemy fire was intensifying, and staying in the open meant almost certain death. But Sarah could see her wounded teammates lying exposed on the rocky ground. They were crying out for help, bleeding heavily and unable to move to safety on their own. The decision to stay and help them had been instinctive, not calculated. For the next 4 hours, the captain's voice continued. Petty Officer Martinez repeatedly exposed herself to enemy fire to drag wounded soldiers to safety. She made 7 separate trips across open ground under intense hostile fire. The details of those 4 hours were burned into Sarah's memory. Each trip across the exposed area had felt like a lifetime. She could remember the weight of each wounded soldier as she dragged them to cover. She could remember the sound of bullets whistling past her head, and the way her hands shook as adrenaline coursed through her body. During one of those trips, shrapnel from an exploding grenade had torn through her left arm, leaving scars that were now covered by intricate tattoo work. She had barely felt the pain at the time, focused entirely on getting her teammate to safety. When helicopter evacuation finally arrived, the captain announced, all 7 wounded personnel survived their injuries. Military analysts later determined that without Petty Officer Martinez's actions, at least 5 of those soldiers would have died from their wounds. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened to the official account of that day. For so many years, she had been told that her actions were insubordinate and reckless. Her commanding officer had filed reports criticizing her decision to disobey orders, and those reports had followed her for the rest of her military career. The aftermath of the mission had been almost as traumatic as the mission itself. Sarah had been subjected to multiple investigations and disciplinary proceedings. Some officers had argued that her disobedience of direct orders set a dangerous precedent, regardless of the positive outcome. The stress and controversy had eventually led to her decision to leave the military. She had felt betrayed by the system she had served, unable to understand how saving lives could be viewed as misconduct. The transition to civilian life had been difficult, marked by depression, anxiety, and a deep sense of loss. The investigation of these events was complicated by political considerations and classified intelligence, the captain explained. For 15 years, the full truth of what happened that day remained hidden from public view. Sarah knew that the political complications stemmed from the fact that her commanding officer during the mission had been the son of a powerful senator. The man had later been promoted despite his questionable decisions during the ambush. Investigating his orders would have created embarrassing questions about nepotism and political influence in military promotions. It had taken a change in political leadership and a thorough review of classified files for the truth to finally emerge. The review had revealed that Sarah's commanding officer had made several tactical errors that contributed to the ambush. His order for personnel to retreat had been motivated more by panic than by sound military strategy. Today we correct a historical injustice, the captain announced. We recognize that sometimes the highest form of military discipline is knowing when orders must be disobeyed in order to save lives. The crowd erupted in applause at these words. Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her as she realized that her actions were finally being validated. After 15 years of doubt and criticism, the military was acknowledging that she had made the right choice. Behind her, she noticed that the group of young sailors had fallen silent. The gravity of what they were hearing seemed to be sinking in. Sarah hoped they were beginning to understand that military service was more complicated than following rules and maintaining appearances. At this time, the captain announced, I would like to invite General Harrison to present the Medal of Honor to former Petty Officer Sarah Martinez. The moment had arrived. Sarah stood up on slightly shaky legs and began walking toward the stage. As she moved, she could hear the crowd rising to their feet in a show of respect. The sound of hundreds of people applauding filled the air around her. General Harrison was waiting at the podium with the Medal of Honor in his hands. As Sarah approached, she could see the kindness in his eyes and the genuine respect in his expression. Whatever happened next, she knew she was finally among people who understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice. Sarah climbed the steps to the stage, her military bearing returning automatically despite the years away from service. The wooden platform felt solid beneath her feet, and the microphone at the podium seemed to amplify every small sound. General Harrison stood waiting for her with a warm smile that immediately put her at ease. "Sarah Martinez," he said in a voice that carried clearly across the ceremony area, "it is my honor to finally meet you." As Sarah reached the center of the stage, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. The crowd had fallen silent, waiting for this historic moment. She could see news cameras focused on the stage, knowing that this ceremony would be broadcast and recorded for posterity. General Harrison gestured for her to stand beside him as he addressed the crowd. "Today we witnessed something that should have happened 15 years ago," he began. "We are here to right a wrong and to honor courage that has gone unrecognized for far too long." Sarah stood at attention, her hands clasped behind her back in the familiar military posture. The general's words felt like a vindication of everything she had endured since leaving the service. For the first time in years, she felt truly proud of her military service. "The Medal of Honor is not awarded lightly," General Harrison continued. "It requires proof of valor far beyond what we expect even from our finest service members. It requires the willingness to risk everything for others, even when doing so means disobeying direct orders." The general paused and looked directly at Sarah. Petty Officer Martinez demonstrated that kind of valor on a mountainside in Afghanistan 15 years ago. She chose saving lives over following orders, and 7 families still have their loved ones because of that choice. As the general spoke, Sarah noticed movement in the crowd. Several people were making their way toward the front of the ceremony area. She recognized some of them immediately. They were the soldiers she had saved that day, now older but still clearly recognizable. Marcus Williams was there, the young corpsman who had been shot in the leg during the initial ambush. Sarah remembered dragging him to safety during her second trip across the exposed ground. He was now wearing a dress uniform with sergeant's stripes, indicating he had continued his military career. Jennifer Torres was also present, the radio operator who had suffered shrapnel wounds to her back and arms. Sarah had carried her during the longest and most dangerous rescue, a trip that had taken nearly 20 minutes under constant enemy fire. Jennifer was now in civilian clothes, but her posture and bearing still showed her military background. The sight of these survivors brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She had often wondered what had happened to them after their recovery. Seeing them healthy and successful filled her with a joy she hadn't expected to feel. General Harrison noticed the survivors as well, and gestured toward them. "Some of the people whose lives were saved that day are here with us today. Their presence serves as living proof of the impact that one person's courage can have." The crowd turned to look at the survivors, who stood proudly despite the attention. Marcus Williams raised his hand in a brief wave, while Jennifer Torres nodded solemnly. The sight of them clearly moved many people in the audience, including some of the young sailors who had been critical earlier. "Before we proceed with the presentation," General Harrison said, "I want to address something that I know has been a source of concern for some people today." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She suspected he was about to mention her tattoos, and she wasn't sure what he was going to say about them. The general began rolling up his sleeves as he spoke. "I understand that there has been some discussion about Petty Officer Martinez's appearance, specifically regarding her tattoos." Sarah could hear murmuring from the crowd as people tried to see what the general was revealing. As his sleeves rolled higher, intricate tattoo work became visible on both of his arms. The designs were clearly military-themed, with anchors, eagles, and what appeared to be unit insignia. "I have tattoos myself," General Harrison announced matter-of-factly. "They represent my 32 years of service and the units I was privileged to lead. They help me remember the people I served with and the lessons I learned along the way." The murmuring in the crowd grew louder as people absorbed this unexpected revelation. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her as she realized the general was defending her choice to express her military experience, through tattoo art. Petty Officer Martinez's tattoos tell the story of her service and her healing, the general continued. Each design represents either a fallen comrade or a step in her recovery from the trauma of combat. They are not signs of rebellion or poor judgment. They are expressions of honor and remembrance. Sarah was amazed by the general's understanding and support. She had never expected such a high-ranking officer to defend her tattoos so publicly and eloquently. Military service changes people, General Harrison said, his voice growing more passionate. It marks us in ways that go far deeper than skin. Some of us carry those marks on the outside where others can see them. Others carry them only on the inside, where they remain invisible but equally permanent. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Sarah could see that the general's speech was having a powerful impact on the audience, especially the younger service members who had been judgmental earlier. What matters is not how we choose to remember our service, but whether we served with honor when our country needed us, the general declared. Petty Officer Martinez served with extraordinary honor. Her actions saved lives and demonstrated the highest ideals of military service. Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she listened to these words. For 15 years, she had carried shame and doubt about her military experience. The general's speech was washing away years of accumulated pain and self-doubt. The tattoos on her arms tell the stories of Corporal Jenkins, Sergeant Miller, and Private First Class Rodriguez, the general continued, naming Sarah's fallen teammates. They tell the story of survival, recovery, and the determination to honor those who didn't make it home. Sarah was stunned that the general knew the specific meaning of her tattoos. Someone had clearly done extensive research into her background and the significance of her body art. These are not the markings of someone who lacks discipline, General Harrison stated firmly. These are the markings of someone who understands the true cost of freedom and chooses to carry that knowledge with her always. The general turned to face Sarah directly. Your tattoos honor your service and your fallen comrades. They represent healing and remembrance. There is nothing shameful about them, and anyone who suggests otherwise fundamentally misunderstands what military service is really about. Sarah felt as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The shame and self-consciousness she had carried for years was dissolving in the face of this unexpected acceptance and understanding. General Harrison reached for the Medal of Honor, lifting it carefully from its presentation case. The gold star caught the morning sunlight, casting small reflections across the stage. The blue ribbon seemed to glow against the dark blue of the presentation box. Sarah Martinez, he said formally, by direction of the President of the United States and in the name of Congress, I present you with the Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. As the general placed the medal around Sarah's neck, she felt the weight of the honor settling onto her shoulders. It was heavier than she had expected, both physically and emotionally. The ribbon felt cool against her neck and the metal star rested just above her heart. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause. People were standing, clapping, and many were wiping away tears. Sarah could see camera flashes going off throughout the audience as photographers captured this historic moment. The sound of the applause seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings, creating a wall of appreciation and respect. Sarah tried to maintain her military composure, but the emotion of the moment was overwhelming. She had dreamed of this recognition for years, never truly believing it would happen. Now that it was real, she felt a complex mixture of pride, relief, and sadness for those who hadn't lived to see this day. General Harrison leaned closer, so only she could hear him over the applause. Your country owes you an apology for how long this took, he said quietly. But more importantly, your country owes you gratitude for your courage and sacrifice. As the applause began to die down, Sarah noticed that many of the young sailors who had been critical earlier were now clapping enthusiastically. She could see recognition and respect in their faces, replacing the judgment and disapproval from before. The general's speech had clearly changed their perspective. Marcus Williams, one of the soldiers she had saved, was making his way toward the stage. General Harrison noticed him approaching and gestured for him to join them on the platform. Marcus climbed the steps and walked over to Sarah with a broad smile on his face. Petty Officer Martinez, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I never got the chance to properly thank you for what you did that day. You saved my life and I've thought about you every day since then. Sarah found herself unable to speak as Marcus continued. I have 3 children now. My oldest daughter just started college, and my twin boys are in high school. They exist because you were brave enough to come back for me when everyone else said to retreat. The crowd could hear every word through the microphone system, and many people were openly crying now. Sarah felt tears streaming down her own cheeks as she listened to Marcus describe his family and his life after Afghanistan. I named my daughter Sarah, he added with a smile. She knows the story of why she has that name, and she's always been proud to share it with a real hero. Jennifer Torres had also made her way to the stage and was climbing the steps. She approached Sarah with the same emotional intensity that Marcus had shown. "You carried me for 20 minutes under enemy fire," Jennifer said, her voice shaking slightly. "The doctor said I would have bled to death if you hadn't gotten me to the medic when you did." Jennifer reached into her purse and pulled out a small photograph. "This is my son," she said, showing Sarah the picture of a teenage boy in a baseball uniform. "He's 15 now and he plays shortstop for his high school team. He's never known a world where his mother wasn't there for him, and that's because of you." Sarah finally found her voice. "You don't need to thank me," she said softly. "I just did what anyone would have done in that situation." "No," Marcus said firmly. "Most people would have followed orders and retreated to safety. You chose to risk everything for people who were basically strangers to you at the time." General Harrison had been listening to this exchange with obvious emotion. He stepped forward and addressed the crowd again. "This is what the Medal of Honor represents," he said. "Not just individual courage, but the ripple effects of that courage through generations. The children and grandchildren, who exist because one person chose to do the right thing when it mattered most." He turned back to Sarah. "I want you to know that your story has already been included in the curriculum at the Naval Academy and other military training facilities. Future officers will learn about the importance of moral courage and the responsibility to protect those under their command." Sarah was amazed to learn that her story was being used for educational purposes. She had never imagined that her experience could help train future military leaders. "Your case study focuses on the complexity of military decision-making and the importance of situational leadership," the general continued. "It teaches future officers that sometimes the most difficult decisions are also the most important ones." Another survivor from that day, David Chen, had made his way to the stage. He was now wearing the uniform of a Navy lieutenant, indicating that he had not only recovered from his wounds but had continued to serve and advance in rank. "Petty Officer Martinez," he said as he approached, "I want you to know that your example has guided my entire military career. Every time I've faced a difficult decision, I've asked myself what you would have done in that situation." David continued, "I've had the opportunity to command troops in combat situations 3 times since Afghanistan. Each time I've remembered your example of putting the welfare of your people above all other considerations. That lesson has made me a better leader and a better person." The crowd was completely silent as they listened to these testimonials. The impact of Sarah's actions was becoming clear, not just in terms of the lives saved that day, but in terms of the ongoing influence on military leadership and decision-making. General Harrison nodded appreciatively at David's words. "This is exactly the kind of leadership we need in our military," he said. "Leaders who understand that rules and regulations exist to serve a higher purpose, and who have the courage to act according to that purpose when necessary." Sarah looked out at the crowd and saw hundreds of faces looking back at her with respect and admiration. The same young sailors who had been critical earlier were now listening intently to every word. She could see that they were beginning to understand the complexity of military service and the importance of moral courage. "I want to say something to the younger service members in the audience," Sarah said, stepping closer to the microphone. Her voice was stronger now, filled with confidence from the support she was receiving. "Military service is not about blind obedience to authority," she continued. "It's about understanding the principles that authority is supposed to serve and having the courage to uphold those principles, even when it's difficult or dangerous." The crowd was hanging on every word as Sarah shared the wisdom she had gained from her experience. "The tattoos on my arms represent more than just memories," she said. "They represent lessons about sacrifice, courage, and the responsibility we have to take care of each other. Every design tells a story about what it means to serve something greater than yourself." Sarah looked out over the crowd, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded her for 15 years. The Medal of Honor felt warm against her chest, and the faces looking back at her showed understanding rather than judgment. She decided to share more of her story, hoping it might help others who had faced similar struggles. When I left the military 15 years ago, I was broken, she continued, her voice carrying clearly across the silent ceremony area. I had nightmares every night. I couldn't understand how saving lives could be viewed as wrong. I felt betrayed by the system I had devoted my life to serving. The crowd remained completely silent, absorbed in her deeply personal testimony. Sarah could see that many people were moved by her honesty about the struggles that followed her military service. I spent years in therapy, trying to process what had happened and find meaning in my experience, she said. The transition to civilian life was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I lost my sense of purpose and struggled with depression and anxiety. Sarah paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. That's when I started getting tattoos. Each one represented a step in my healing process or a way to honor someone I had lost. My therapist encouraged me to find healthy ways to express my emotions and process my trauma. She gestured toward her covered arms. The eagle on my right shoulder represents the 3 teammates we lost that day. The compass on my left wrist reminds me to always find my way back to my values, even when the path is unclear. The phoenix on my forearm symbolizes rising from the ashes of that terrible experience. The crowd was listening intently, many people nodding and understanding. Sarah could see that her openness about mental health and healing was resonating with both veterans and active duty personnel in the audience. I want every person here to understand that seeking help is not a sign of weakness, she said firmly. Getting therapy, taking medication if you need it, finding healthy ways to cope with trauma. These are all acts of courage. They're part of continuing to serve even after your official service is over. General Harrison nodded approvingly at her words. The military had made significant strides in addressing mental health issues in recent years, but there was still work to be done in removing the stigma around seeking help. For years, I thought my military career was a failure because of how it ended, Sarah continued. I thought the criticism and disciplinary actions meant that everything I had done was worthless. Today I understand that my real legacy wasn't the paperwork or the official records. My legacy was the lives that were saved and the families that remained whole. Marcus Williams, still standing on the stage, wiped tears from his eyes as he listened to Sarah's speech. Jennifer Torres and David Chen were equally moved by her words about finding meaning in service, despite official recognition. I also want to address the young sailors who were concerned about my tattoos, Sarah said, looking directly at the group that had been critical earlier. I understand your concerns about military standards and professionalism. These are important values and they serve a vital purpose in maintaining discipline and unit cohesion. The young sailors looked surprised that she was addressing them directly, but they listened respectfully as she continued. But I also want you to understand that military service is complex and personal, she said. Each of us processes our experiences differently, and each of us finds different ways to honor our service and our fallen comrades. What matters most is not whether we all look the same, but whether we all share the same commitment to protecting and serving others. One of the young sailors, a petty officer with a serious expression, raised his hand slightly. Sarah nodded for him to speak. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone system. "I want to apologize for the comments my friends and I made earlier. We didn't understand the meaning behind your tattoos or the experiences that led to them." Sarah smiled warmly at the young man. "No apology necessary, petty officer. You were expressing legitimate concerns about military standards. I hope my explanation helps you understand that there's often more to someone's story than what's visible on the surface." The young sailor nodded gratefully and sat back down. Sarah could see that the conversation had been educational for many people in the audience, not just the few who had been openly critical. "I want to close by talking about what this medal means to me," Sarah said, touching the Medal of Honor gently. "It's not just recognition for what happened 15 years ago. It's validation that the values I tried to live by during my service were the right ones." She looked out over the crowd again, seeing faces that reflected hope, understanding, and renewed commitment to service. "This medal represents the principle that protecting others is more important than protecting yourself," she continued. "It represents the idea that sometimes you have to risk everything to do what's right, and it represents the understanding that true military discipline comes from within, from a commitment to values that transcend rules and regulations. General Harrison stepped forward again. "Petty Officer Martinez, your words today have been as powerful as your actions 15 years ago," he said. "You've given all of us a reminder of what military service is really about." The general turned to address the crowd. "I want everyone here to remember this moment and these words. This is what leadership looks like. This is what courage looks like. And this is what it means to serve with honor." Sarah felt a profound sense of completion as she looked out over the crowd one final time. The young faces looking back at her showed understanding and respect rather than judgment. The survivors of that terrible day in Afghanistan were standing proudly, their presence serving as living proof of the impact that one person's courage could have. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for this honor, and thank you for finally allowing me to tell the complete story of what happened that day. I hope it helps others understand that military service is about more than following orders. It's about understanding why those orders exist and having the courage to serve the principles behind them." The crowd erupted in the longest and loudest applause of the entire ceremony. People were standing, clapping, and many were openly crying. The sound seemed to go on forever, a thunderous expression of respect and gratitude that filled the entire ceremony area. As the applause finally began to fade, Sarah felt a transformation taking place within herself. The shame and doubt that had haunted her for 15 years were dissolving, replaced by a deep sense of validation and peace. She looked around the stage at the people who had gathered there, the general who had defended her, the survivors whose lives she had saved, and the young sailors who had learned something important about judgment and understanding. General Harrison approached the microphone one final time. "Before we conclude today's ceremony, I have one more announcement to make," he said. The crowd settled back into their seats, curious about what else might be coming. "Effective immediately, the Navy is implementing new policies regarding tattoos and their significance in military service," the general announced. "We are creating a program that will help service members understand the difference between tattoos that represent rebellion and those that represent remembrance, healing, and honor." Sarah was surprised by this unexpected development. She hadn't realized that her ceremony would lead to actual policy changes within the military. "Furthermore," the general continued, "we are establishing the Sarah Martinez Leadership Award, which will be given annually to service members who demonstrate moral courage in difficult circumstances. This award will recognize those who understand that true military discipline sometimes requires the wisdom to know when rules must be set aside to serve higher principles." The crowd burst into applause again, and Sarah felt overwhelmed by the honor of having an award named after her. The idea that her experience could help recognize and encourage moral courage in future service members was more meaningful to her than any personal recognition. The first recipient of this award, General Harrison announced, will be Lieutenant David Chen, who used the lessons he learned from Petty Officer Martinez to save lives during his own command experiences in combat. David Chen looked shocked as his name was called. He had clearly not expected to receive any recognition today, beyond the opportunity to thank Sarah publicly. As he stepped forward to accept the award, Sarah felt proud that her example had contributed to his development as a leader. As the formal ceremony concluded, people began to disperse, but many approached the stage to speak with Sarah personally. She found herself surrounded by active duty personnel, veterans, and family members who wanted to share their own stories or simply express their gratitude. A young female sailor approached with tears in her eyes. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for talking about mental health and getting help," she said quietly. "I've been struggling since my deployment, but I was afraid that seeking therapy would hurt my career." Sarah put a gentle hand on the young woman's shoulder. "Getting help was the best decision I ever made," she said. "It didn't make me weaker, it made me stronger and more capable of helping others. Don't let fear prevent you from taking care of yourself." The sailor nodded gratefully and promised to make an appointment with a counselor. Sarah realized that this conversation might be just as important as the formal ceremony itself. Marcus Williams approached with his family, his wife and 3 children, including the daughter named Sarah. The teenage girl looked exactly like Sarah had imagined, with bright eyes and a confident smile. "Sarah," Marcus said, introducing his daughter, "meet the person you were named after." The young Sarah stepped forward with the poise of someone who had grown up hearing stories about courage and service. "It's an honor to meet you," she said. My dad has told me so many stories about what you did. I've always been proud to have your name." Sarah felt her heart swell with emotion as she looked at this bright young woman who represented the future that her actions had made possible. "The honor is mine," she replied. "Your father was incredibly brave that day, too. He never gave up even when he was wounded and scared." Jennifer Torres introduced her son, the baseball player she had mentioned earlier. The teenager was tall and athletic, with his mother's determined expression. "Mom told me you saved her life," he said simply. "Thank you for making sure I got to have a mom." These personal encounters meant more to Sarah than all the formal recognition and official ceremony. Seeing the real, tangible impact of her actions in the faces of children and families made everything worthwhile. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself in conversation with the group of young sailors who had initially been critical of her tattoos. Their leader, the petty officer who had apologized earlier, asked if he could speak with her privately. "Ma'am, I wanted you to know that this ceremony has completely changed how I think about military service," he said. "I thought it was all about following rules and maintaining appearances. I didn't understand that sometimes the most important thing is knowing why the rules exist in the first place." Sarah nodded approvingly. "That's the most important lesson anyone in the military can learn," she said. "Rules and regulations are tools to help us serve effectively, but they're not ends in themselves. The real goal is always to protect and serve others." The young sailor looked thoughtful. "I have a tattoo myself," he admitted. "I got it after my grandfather died. He was a World War II veteran, and the tattoo honors his service. I was always worried that it would be seen as unprofessional." "What matters is the meaning behind it," Sarah replied. "If it helps you remember your grandfather's example and stay connected to the values he represented, then it's serving a positive purpose." As the sun began to set over Naval Base Norfolk, Sarah found herself standing alone for a moment. Looking out over the harbor where ships were preparing for evening operations, the weight of the Medal of Honor around her neck felt different now, not heavy with burden but solid with purpose and meaning. General Harrison approached her one final time. "I hope you'll consider returning to active duty," he said. "The Navy could use more leaders like you." Sarah smiled but shook her head gently. "My service now is different, but it's still service," she replied. "I work with veterans who are struggling with PTSD and transition issues. I help them understand that their experiences have value and that their struggles don't define them." The general nodded with understanding. "That's just as important as any military role," he said. "Maybe more important." As Sarah prepared to leave the base, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just one day. She had arrived feeling uncertain and somewhat ashamed of her appearance and her past. She was leaving with a sense of validation, purpose, and peace that she hadn't felt in 15 years. The Medal of Honor represented more than recognition for past actions. It represented the understanding that her values and choices had been correct, that her sacrifice had meaning, and that her story could help others navigate their own difficult decisions. Most importantly, it represented the completion of a long journey from shame to pride, from isolation to community, and from doubt to certainty about the value of moral courage in a complex world. Sarah Martinez drove away from Naval Base Norfolk with the Medal of Honor carefully placed in her passenger seat and a renewed sense of purpose in her heart. Her story had finally been told in full, and she was ready to use that story to help others find their own paths to healing and service.